Hello, everyone. Happy December. It is time for a niche conversation. Today, we are going to be diving back into the animal history realm and talking to Margaryta Golovchenko about her research. I'm going to invite her into the combo. She's here. Second. Let's see. Invite again. There we go. Oh, I can't see. There you
Go.
are. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I am Jessica DeWitt. I'm one of the editors here at the Network in Canadian History and Environment. And today for Niche Conversations, I am joined by Margaryta Golovchenko. Do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Sure. I'm a PhD candidate in the art history department at the University of Oregon. I did my degrees in Canada, so I'm very familiar with NiCHE and kind of all of the, a lot of the connections and the people who are working in it. So I'm really excited to be part of it, despite being on the other side of the border for now.
Yeah. Isabel mentioned that you had once been part of the visual cultures of the Circumpolar North
Yeah.
group.
She's actually the reason why I knew about the series.
Yeah.
She mentioned to me, she said, "Oh, there's this really great call. I think you'd be interested." So shout out to Isabel. Thank you for thank you for connecting me finally and kind of bringing me into conversation with NiCHE.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for coming. And today we're going to be talking about your piece for the Animal Encounters series called The Search for the Animal Corpus. And I thought, since we haven't met before, this is our first digital meeting, I thought I'd ask a bit about, your personal relationship to animals, or maybe your personal animal story, whatever you want to call it, and how that has shaped your research journey.
That's a great question. And I often think about it because interestingly, I don't have pets myself.
Yeah.
I didn't, I mean, I had, there was a cat when I was like the first 4 years of my life when I lived in Ukraine, which is where I was born and then immigrated to Toronto with my parents. There was a cat in my life, and it was a very kind of one of those beautiful Angora kind of cats, but it was a very aggressive one. And then after we moved, we never actually had pets. I remember when I was little, really wanted pets myself, but like my mom grew up in a rural setting, so she had exposure to animals. She had a very good understanding of kind of all of the obligations that came with it in city life and living in a condo.
Yeah.
So I often think about how, and this kind of I think nicely ties in with some of the other things that you asked about. In your other questions, which I think a lot of times the assumption is that if you're writing, especially about animals, there's like a personal level of care for them and an investment. And it's interesting because I think for me, there is a care for animals, but it's not coming from, I guess, like a pet owner or that kind of relationship, because I didn't really have that kind of relationship. I mean, my husband has two cats, which are like I'm also very closely bonded with, but we don't like I don't see them often because we're long distance right now. So kind of animals are in my life, but it's interesting that they're more sort of as this kind of art historical subject that I study. They're not necessarily as like someone I go home to and I kind of like cuddle, which is not to say that I don't care about animals, but I just think it's interesting because in art history, especially, there's a lot of assumptions that you're going to be studying what's closest to you. So like culturally, linguistically, maybe if you're like a practicing artist, there's a medium that you gravitate to. And I don't think that's always true. I think it's actually more complicated than that, and just yeah, maybe that's something worth a conversation worth having more often, maybe in these kinds of intersectional spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that answer. And I think it's a very interesting one. And it's why I asked, because I think there is an assumption that people who do animal history or whatever topic are very close to it or what have you. And I love when it's a more complex I can't, like, I don't know. And even my own like relationship to animals, like I grew up like very connected to my animals, like my dogs and my cats, because I was an only child in the middle of nowhere. So they were like my main companions. And I still have 3 cats, but I find my thinking about the morality of having pet ownership and just like that centering that kind of relationship to animals is, you know, there's other ways of being in a relationship with animals that doesn't require that kind of intimacy. Anyways, so cool. Yeah, so in the piece, you're talking about archives and finding animals, and a lot of it is this idea between companion animals and a more like functional relationships. And I was wondering if you could just talk about, you know, how does the archival record differ between these two groups of animals?
Yeah. So I kind of, as I'm the piece ties really closely with my dissertation, and one of the things is that I've noticed there's animals kind of as like symbols or objects, and then there's animals as kind of subjects, and then there's animals as companions. And the one where animals are as companions and where they are actually named, and I really felt the sense of them as individuals, was with Queen Victoria, who I kind of briefly mentioned. And I was able to go to the UK this summer, and I did some research, and I sat in Windsor Castle a lot, and I looked through like letters that she wrote and correspondence, and then her notebooks are digitized as well. She was a very, very prolific writer, and she she writes about a lot of these animals like they are parts of the family. So, for example, Prince Albert, he had his favorite greyhound named Eos, who toward kind of in the last 6 months of the dog's life, she was in a horrible hunting accident where Victoria's uncle shoots her by accident, and then the dog gets sick. And so the way she writes in these letters to King Leopold of Belgium, who was her uncle, and then other members of the family, she talks about Eos like by name, like a child. And there's actually moments where she says like, Eos is being kind of a baby. I don't want to let her sleep in the bed with me. She's on a strict diet to get her better. So she talks about her in this kind of very companion way. But then there are other times where, for example, I wrote a chapter on a painting by Horace Vernet called An Algerian Lady Hunting. It's in the Wallace collection. And there, the animal is more of a symbol. I was more looking at the falcon that this woman is holding and the Arabian horse, and thinking about kind of their connection to like wildness, and thinking about like Jack Halberstam and some of those ideas of like not quite queer ecology, but in that kind of general territory, just dipping the toe in. So I found that animals kind of as individuals and as companions, that really seems to be bound up to the kind of the ownership dynamic. To put it very simply, I know Donna Haraway would not be happy with me putting it that way. But that's not, but kind of the point of my dissertation also is that that's not the only relationship that like women in particular had with animals, because I think a lot of it is this kind of, we still default to this idea that like women love like small cuddly animals that are maybe like birds or, you know, something like very small, and kind of showing that there are more complex ways, and kind of how that also is enfolded in ideas of like empire in particular.
I love that. And just like it's also kind of showing how, you know, the same things that shape the human archive, such as knowing a whole lot about the royals, also shapes our knowledge of animals and human animal relationships. And it's really difficult to jump those divides and really encounter people like animals outside of that, or encounter just like different kinds of animal relationships. But I like how you are seeing those different relationships even in these archives that are more easily accessible. That's cool.
There are
Um,
also things that are like objects that are very like unexpected to find in the archives. Like I was in Balmoral Castle in Scotland, and they had this very fascinating, it was a ram's head, and they explained to me that they used to have snuff in it, and it was kind of wheeled around with the, that says it's a very I've never heard of these kinds of objects before, and apparently it's a very particular kind of category, and they have like these giant, I don't remember what they're called, but there's a gem that is popular in Scotland and kind of has a very rich history to it, and so it's this kind of very fascinating object that like also has a gender dynamic, because they explained to me they had like two little different pathways where like women and men could take snuff at the same time. So like that's another type of
yeah,
like animal presence in the archive that's like, it's not a named
yeah.
animal, we don't know who can, so it's not, it's also not just about I think maybe some of the misconception is people might think that it's about finding like the name of the animal and kind of, you know, animal as individual, but it's also about seeing, you know, kind of which animals were used for what, and kind of thinking about it maybe more on a material
Mhm.
level as well.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, I like that. Cool. So I noticed in your piece when I was reading it that it was a kind of like a thread of emotional ecology running through it. And so I wanted to wrap up by kind of like picking your brain about what you think of as the role of emotion, both for these historical actors as well as for researchers that are examining them.
I really love the term that you used, emotional ecology. I've never heard of that one, so I was also just curious, like if that was your term or if that's
Um,
someone I'm reading.
it is not my term specifically. I did edit a series for NiCHE last year in 2023 with my friend Sarah York Bertram called Emotional Ecologies.
Oh wow, I love
So
it.
it's not specifically our term, but it's a fairly new one.
I love
So,
it. I love it because I think it connects really nicely to something that I one of my professors, Tamarel Sheikh from York University, mentioned to me, and I've kind of kept really near and dear to me. He said it's important to recognize desire when you're whatever, for whatever it is you're
yeah,
studying, whether it's like desire for, or kind of like repulsion is a negative
yes.
desire as well. And so I've kind of kept that close, and kind of asked like, why do I gravitate towards certain things?
Mhm.
And so I think of emotional ecology not just as like I said, like Queen Victoria is the obvious example of like someone who emotionally really cared for animals, but I think it's also a part of the emotional ecology. A very important one, I think, is the relationship between the researcher and the objects
Mhm.
that they are writing about. And so um again, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about how I think there's an idea that you have to be like an animal, a big animal lover, and like I know I've met animal studies scholars who say like you can't be a good animal studies scholar if you're not a vegan. So it's very interesting kind of
Yeah.
where these kind of perceptions of interconnections lie, and
Mhm.
so I think it's about, there has to be a level of care, I think, for what you're writing about, what you're studying, because I think that um, what we do is not clinical. It's not, we
Mhm.
can't think of it as objective, because that would be just a failure of the humanities. It's not
Yeah.
possible. So I think a level of care is actually integral to a topic like this, because that's where we start asking the harder questions. And I think
Mhm.
sometimes that kind of emotional ecology, as you call it, is actually what sort of pushes us over the line to engage in kind of what Donna Haraway talks about as speculative fabulism,
Yeah.
and that kind of imagining of like, if we don't have the answers, what kind of, where can we fill in the blanks, or how can we sort of imagine outward? And I think that's really important for a topic like this, where I, for example, had to scrap a chapter idea because I wasn't able to find information on like animal transportation, like where exactly exotic animals came from. And maybe I was looking in the wrong archives. That is highly possible, but
Mhm.
there's sometimes the archival record isn't there, and that doesn't mean that these questions aren't worth asking. I think it's just about kind of where do we then orient ourselves in relation to the material and the kind of the questions. I think that's where the questions really start to become important.
I love that idea of care, and yeah, how well. First of all, it reminds me of like Caroline Abbott, who I think is on the call, and how they're kind of, that was kind of at the core of this series call, was this idea of caring for these animals in the archive. Like, how do we show respect to them? How do we unveil them? How do we care for their stories? And it's also just a way of looking at, yeah, the historical researchers, like, relationship to our subjects, and it kind of strikes me as a way of avoiding more extractive research. And what is your role in caring for these past beings, these past ideas, what have you. I like that a lot. And I also like that point about desire, and it got me thinking about like my desire for my like dissertation research and like how that changed through my PhD, and like lessened desire made it harder to finish and that sort of thing. So I think that's a cool thing to leave people on, is to think about desire in relationship to your subject of study. That's really cool. Okay, well, thank you for joining me today. This was a really fun and thought-provoking conversation. Everyone should everyone should check out your piece. Everyone should check out the Animal Encounters series. And yeah, thanks for joining me today, Margaryta.
Thank you.
Take care.